My name's Marty and welcome to this instructional video series on building your own ST H-style guitar kit from Guitar Kit World. In the following video, I'm going to show you how I put together this guitar, including all aspects of the build from finishing, installing hardware, connecting up the electronics, and then performing a final setup at the end just to ensure the guitar plays great. So, if you've never put together a kit guitar yourself before or are concerned you don't have any specialist tools, don't worry. I'm not a luthier myself or even that particularly handy. But just about anyone can put together a guitar like this with some basic tools and just a little bit of patience. Okay, so the guitar we're working on today is an ST H-style guitar kit. As you can see, it's a semi-hollow body guitar. We've got a mahogany body, maple neck, and engineered ebony fretboard with mother of pearl dot inlays. We've got two soap bar style P90 pickups, tune-o-matic bridge, and a floating Jazzmaster style tremolo system. We've got a 3-way selector switch, one volume and one tone. Okay, so from here I'm going to roll the video back to the very start and we'll begin the job by inspecting the body for any marks or scratches. What I normally do is just hold the guitar at different angles in the light and look for any marks or scratches. You're generally going to see marks and scratches, machine marks and things like that around the bottom of the guitar and occasionally around the horns as well. When you're sanding, just sand with the grain. Don't press too hard, and just be sure to unclog your paper as needed. Now, once we've done that, the next thing we really need to do is just check the neck fit. So it's important that you've got a tight fitting neck. It shouldn't be so tight that you can barely get it into the neck pocket, but it shouldn't be so loose that you've got sideways movement either. So what you want to do is push the heel of a neck in first and then bring it down flat. And as you can see, there's no sideways movement with that neck. That's a good fit. So before we start grain filling or applying finish of any sort, one of the first things we need to do is also mask off any of these cavities. Today we're going to be using a pre-tinted grain fill, which hopefully should make the grain pattern of this guitar pop a little under the more translucent stain finish we'll be doing over the top. Grain fill like this should be mixed to a fairly runny consistency, something like glue. I've added about 20% water to the product here, but just check the manufacturer's recommendations on the product you're using. It's likely to be similar. So next, using a clean rag, I'll start working the grain filler into the body of the guitar. We're just first of all coming across it like so, working with the grain. And the idea is we really want to work as much of this into the grain as possible. Now, just before you design your own headstock, just a couple of things to keep in mind. So, if you're designing your own, just be sure to mark out where the tuning pegs go or where the tuning peg holes go. You don't want to cut your headstock too close to the tuning holes. I'd recommend keeping at least 15 mil to the center of the hole, which is the equivalent of a typical spacing between tuning peg holes, for example. Always cut well outside the lines as well. You've got plenty of room to work with when it comes time to start dressing the cut you've made by sanding it back or filing. And if you don't have specialist tools, just keep the shape simple. So using hard lines rather than too many curves. A well executed simple design often looks better than a poorly executed complex design, for example. It's also worth masking off the headstock at the top and the bottom to ensure you don't leave scratches when you're cutting out your shape. And don't just focus on staying outside the lines, also focus on keeping your saw relatively straight. Okay, so we've cut out a headstock shape, our template. What I'll do next is position that on the headstock where I want it to be and clamp that on. As we can see, that's our headstock cutout. I've left the guitar overnight. I've given it 2 coats of grain fill. I removed any excess about 20 minutes after I first put it on with a rag, and now we've just got some excess here to sand away. So when you're sanding grain fill, it's fairly simple, but all we really want to do is just sand down to the surface of the timber. So the idea of it is just to remove anything that's sitting on the surface and leave the product that's filled the pores. So to do that, I'd recommend starting with 120 grit paper, working up to maybe 180 and then up to about 220. It's unnecessary really to go any higher than that at this stage, and definitely don't skip your grades of paper either. So what I'll do is just sand away a section in this lower horn, and I'll work my way through the grades, and then I'll show the section that I've sanded and just show how it should look. Okay, so if I bring the camera down for a closer view, with the pores or the heavy grain and the heavy lines in the timber are now filled with the product, but we've sanded away the surface, the excess. What I'm going to do next is apply some poly. So I'm using a wipe on poly from Feast Watson. It's an oil-based product. Never wipe anything on using a rag. Just fold the frayed edges in, just so there's no chance of any fibres ending up in the finish on the guitar that you're applying. And just fold over one more, so you've got a nice workable pad. And then I'll just take some of the poly on the rag, and we'll start applying. Okay, so it's been a day since we oiled the base of this guitar. As you can see, thanks to masking off the top there, we've got some nice, we've got a really nice defined line. So what we want to do next, as per my previous plan, is to now mask off this section, and we'll be staining this with staining the top with a light brown. So I'll quickly mask off the body. Okay, so I'm just coming back. It's been about 10 to 15 minutes. I've just got another clean rag. I'm just going to start wiping away any of that excess that's sitting on the surface. What we want to do next is start looking at finishing the neck while the body's drying. So I've already sanded this down to 240, then 320. And lastly, I'm going to finish it off with some 400 grit. So just sanding as normal. You can also use an eraser. Just wrap your sandpaper around that to get to some of these harder to reach areas, or if you want to have some sort of backing there to handle some of these curves. Now, the next thing I want to do is mask off those tuning holes. So if we get too much gunk and stuff built up in there, you'll have a problem installing the tuning holes later, or tuning the tuners later, I should say. Okay, so I'm using a fine buffing oil, which is a combination of tung oil, which will absorb into the timber, and wax, which will sit on the outside. So just get some product on my rag and simply apply as per usual. Okay, so after we oiled the SDH neck yesterday, next thing I want to do is finish this body. So I'm going to be using a fine buffing oil, which is a mixture of tung oil and wax, and the tung oil absorbs into the timber, the wax then sits on the outside and gives us a protective layer, which you can then buff up to a really nice finish. And from here it's just a matter of getting some of this oil in our rag and getting it on the guitar. So next thing I want to do is remove this masking that we've had in place now for a few days and attach the neck. So we'll do that next. Got the neck here. As I said, now because this was an all finished neck, I haven't bothered masking this off or sanding this down, for instance, as it's just an all finish. It's really not going to affect things too much. So as we do, neck heel in first, and push flat, and then from there flip the guitar over. You'll see in your packaging we've got your neck plate and 4 large screws. So neck plate just simply goes on the back here like so. Okay, so we've finished the finishing stage of our SDH guitar kit. So the next stage is to install some hardware. And the best place to start when installing hardware is our strap buttons. On an S-style guitar like this, generally have a strap button at the base and one just off the top horn of the guitar as well. So we'll start with the base. What I've done is put some masking tape on the body of the guitar. I've measured halfway between these 2 cavities, and then using my ruler very carefully so I don't scratch the surface, I've marked center there, and then using a set square, just marked down, measured half. I'm just marking my hole, and then I do the same at the top horn. Now the top horn, you can't really get an alignment correctly, so what I'd suggest is just to eyeball that. Your location, you want to be on the very peak of the slope of the top horn and about halfway down. And then you can remove your tape. So this low-tack tape is pretty useful in this regard because it's not going to remove any finish when you bring it up, when you're pulling it up off the guitar, but it will allow you to mark the guitar. Now the next stage requires a little bit more thought. So essentially whenever you're installing screws on the body of your guitar, you want to drill pilot holes first. And the reason for that are these screws are quite small and fragile. They're not so bad with these strap button holes, but certainly when it comes time to install some of the smaller screws on the top of the body, you'll find that yeah, you do want some pilot holes in place, just so you don't strip those screws when you're putting them in. Now, what I'd recommend is using a drill bit about 2/3 the width of the screw you're about to install, and we want to drill down to 2/3 the depth of the screw. So what you can do, just to make sure you're always measuring to the correct depth, is just use a little bit of tape. As you can see, I've put some tape around the drill bit here. That's approximately 2/3 of the depth of our screw when in place. And I'll drill down to that depth. Now be careful not to drill exactly to that, the tape can move otherwise. And when you're drilling your pilot holes, you want to make sure that you're drilling that hole as straight as possible. We really want our screws to go in. Straight. So put the drill dead flat and drill very slowly. You can see I've already marked half. What I want to do is drill a small pilot hole, but the problem will be there's no real way to get the drill in there. So you can either detach the neck or just work that hole. As I said, I'm less concerned about the strap button screws. They are a little more durable, they're a little bit larger, but certainly drill pilot holes with the rest of the screws. Now, I've got that on that slope and it's matching that top horn. I'm just going to screw that a little bit more. And then from there, what I recommend as well, especially with this particular screw now, is just to dip that in some wax as well, just to make it easier to go into place. Okay, so the next job on the STH guitar kit is to install our tuners. So you'll get your tuner parts in a bag like so, and the way these work, basically they thread through the back of the headstock, the washer sits on top, and the bushing is screwed in place to secure the washer. In your plastic bag that you get the screws and all the components in, you will find 6 short screws and then 2 slightly longer screws for the string trees, which we'll be installing next. So just be aware of that. There's 2 slightly longer screws in your packaging. So these are inline tuners. The posts aren't staggered, which means the posts are different heights as we go further down the neck. So we can basically just install these like so. So the screw that secures this in place faces towards the body of the guitar. We can just thumb tighten these for now. From here, there's a couple of options with regard to aligning the tuners. They generally are facing that direction. You can use a set square to get the alignment correct, or you can also use a steel rule to align the tuners to themselves. I'm going to do that this time, which basically means once we've got them in place, just aligning them along a straight edge like that and then marking it our holes. So I'll get all the tuners on in this place. If you're going to use a set square, you'd need to do them one at a time because the individual tuners get in the way of this set square unless you've got a particularly thin set square. So once you're happy with your placement, take a tool just to mark the holes. And from there, drill your pilot holes. You'll need to reset your depth level on your drill bit just to match 2/3 of that 2/3 of that depth. See that drill bit might be a little large, so I'll go ahead and change this drill bit over and drill those pilot holes, but basically drill them the same way as we've done the other pilot holes on the body already. So we're drilling using a drill bit about 2/3 the width of the screws we're installing, and drill down to about 2/3 depth, taking into account the little lip this screw goes into as well. So once you've got your tuning, your pilot holes done, you can put in your screws and your tuners will be installed. So our next job is to install the bridge. Now we're installing a Intonating style bridge on this guitar, which means we've got bushings that go into these holes pre-drilled, and then the post screws in like so, and that means the bridge is height adjustable. We don't have a stop tail piece as you'll often see with a Intonating bridge. In this case we're using a floating tremolo, a Mustang style floating tremolo. So first we'll install the bridge, our ground wire, and generally when we've got a guitar with a Intonating style bridge, you've got a ground wire that feeds into or feeds through one of the holes of the bridge. So I'll just bring the camera down just to show that. You generally see a very small hole. So as you can see, this one is just where that drill bit is, and that goes through, and from there that will come into the wire, will feed through that hole there and through that hole and into the electronics cavity, and that'll allow us to ground out our wiring. So just get the camera positioned again. So the first thing we need to do is get that ground wire in place. So as you can see, I've removed just some of the PVC on that wire, and then I'll thread it through that hole. And that'll feed through there and into the electronics cavity. And you just leave that loose for now. I like to cut these wires a little bit longer just so I can got some control from the other side as well. And what I often do is just put a little hook on the end of the bare wire, and the idea is we want that wire then to sit hard against this metal bushing, and that will ground out the signal. So from here we just install the bushing. They sometimes take a little bit of encouragement. Just going to tap that in using my mallet, so there'll be a little bit of noise unfortunately, but you can see obviously take the adjustable post out first. Definitely have a piece of timber or something like this between your hammer. If you're using a rubber mallet, it won't matter so much, but I still like to avoid denting the finish. So another way you can do it, if you've got a piece of ply or something, you can just drill a hole just slightly larger than the width of the post hole, and you can protect the top of the guitar like so. And the bridge itself will be in a separate little bag that just sits on top. So our next job will be to install our floating tremolo system here. So these are fairly simple. The arm goes in like so, and they're spring loaded at the back, and as we turn it just adjusts the tension on the strings, which gives us a vibrato effect. Okay, so to install the bridge, I've positioned the Jazzmaster bridge to the back of the cavity. What I've done is push that as far back as I can, and there's no sideways movement then, and I've just secured that in place with some tape. And just the same as we've installed the other hardware, only this time I'm using a slightly bigger screw. I'm just marking the location of those holes. So next we'll install our string trees. Now string trees are these small items you'll see in your packaging just here. There's a little top, a little metal barrel and a screw. And as I was saying before, when you're opening the packet that your tuners come in, you'll find two slightly longer screws, and that's what these are for. And as you can see, one's just a little longer than the other. So string trees generally serve the purpose of increasing the break angle on the strings, and that gives you more stability with the strings across the nut. So it stops the strings rattling around inside the nut. And obviously, we've got a very shallow nut slot for our high E string as well, so that keeps that in place. It also is thought to increase the stain just because there's more downward pressure on the nut. Now, you'll notice you'll have two separate barrel sizes. So the higher barrel is for the for the D and G strings, and the smaller barrel is for the E and B strings. So they essentially sit much like that. You can have them where you like, but I generally line the E and B string up with the tuner for the A string and the second one just between the first two tuners. So from there, generally just mark the hole, try and get it straight. And obviously this is why I had the strings on the guitar as well, so we can line these up. So from there I would loosen off those strings just so they don't get in the way. Now from here, I've also pre-drilled these pickups. These are P90 pickups, they're direct mount. If you look on the direct mount, basically means they go straight into the timber with the screws on the bottom. Now if you look on the underside of the pickup, you'll see an N here for the neck. So you want to thread that one through first. Just through the hole in the side of the neck pickup cavity. That will feed through there like so. And make sure the wire is at the corner closest to the electronics cavity. As I said, I've already put these holes in place. So as I said, they're direct mount pickups, which means they are height adjustable, but only through the two screws in the middle here. We'll finalise our pickup height when we're doing the final setup. And just poke this red wire through the cavity, through the side of the cavity in the corner here. There's a hole there through the electronics cavity. And lastly, we'll fit our bridge pickup. So same thing again, straight through. Make sure the corner closest to the hole. It's been a little bit recarpentered, so I may just need to pull that through. That's coming through now. installation of these is really the same as we've done all other hardware. So I've used my ground down precision screwdriver to mark the holes. I've drilled down to a depth of about 2/3 of the screw using a drill bit, about 2/3 of the width, and marked my holes and then put the pickups in place. And that's really it for hardware installation now. So from here we'll start installing our electronics. First thing, we've got 2 potentiometers, input jack, capacitor, and a 3-way box style pickup selector. So if we're visualizing the guitar, we've got 2 pickups in this case. Now pickup is known as a transducer, and what a transducer does is measure change in something. So in the case of a pickup, we've got a magnet surrounded by copper wire, and that creates an electromagnetic field. When we vibrate a guitar string, which is magnetic, over the top of that field, it creates an AC current, or an alternating current, which can be mapped to sound. And essentially, that current travels along the hot wire, which is a shielded wire on the pickup. And if we plug that straight in, if we plugged in the active wire to the active lug on our input jack, and the ground wire from our pickup to the ground wire lug on our input jack, we'd essentially have sound. What the pickup selector does is allow us to pick either the neck, bridge, or a combination of the 2 pickups. A volume selector is essentially regulating the amount of voltage that passes through it. So if we turn this down, it sends a lot of that voltage to ground. If we turn it right up, none of it's going to ground. In the case of a tone pot, this works slightly differently. We're directing that voltage through this capacitor, which is a filter. And this filter allows high frequencies to pass through quite easily, but doesn't allow low frequencies to pass through. And when this is set up, it's set to ground, which means those high frequencies that pass through go to ground. And that's how we adjust tone. Okay, so moving right along, when it comes to soldering, there's a few basic things we're going to need. For one, we're going to need a soldering iron. Secondly, we're going to need some solder. Third, and what I recommend having on hand, is just a damp rag. A damp sponge like this. And as you get build up on the tip of your soldering iron, just clean it off. Now when it comes to soldering, unless you've been shown properly, a lot of people tend to treat soldering like they're gluing something together, and soldering is a little different to that. Soldering is more about transferring heat. So what I've got is a very hot iron. Well, it's not hot at the moment, obviously, but when it's turned on, I've got a very hot iron, and the solder likes to stick to that. I tin the point of this iron, which basically means I'm giving it a coating of solder, and the solder is drawn to the heat. So if you've ever soldered before and had trouble, if you bring that soldering iron straight onto the component and try and press solder onto that straight away, what you'll find is the solder doesn't want to come off the iron, because the corresponding, or the component we're soldering to, is still cold. So you need to preheat that for a few seconds first. And essentially that's what we're doing. We're transferring heat. Once that next component's hot enough, we hold the solder over it and keep our tip against it, and it will just allow us to melt a little bit of that solder and complete that connection. Now the other thing that's important is tinning. So I've already talked about tinning the tip of your iron. You also need to tin the lugs you're going to be connecting to, which means just putting a very light coating of solder on each of them, and also the wires. The wires you'll be connecting to as well. As you can see, I'm working on my template, and the reason for that is some of the wiring we're going to have to do inside the electronics cavity of the guitar itself, as you can see here. But for the wires that I can connect outside of the guitar, I'd prefer to work outside of the guitar. And then I've put some low-tack tape just around this electronics cavity, just to give it a little more protection. Next thing I've done is go through and tin all the individual lugs. There's just a small amount of solder coating there, and that just helps us bond. Now one of the first jobs we need to do is ground out this volume pot. So the easiest way to do that is to force the lug back onto the shielding. I've bent that pot back. Just apply some heat. Let it heat for a few seconds and just push my solder onto. And it shouldn't take much, as I said. So the next thing we need to do is install our capacitor. And as I said before, our capacitor is essentially a filter. So any current we direct through it, it will filter out specific frequencies and send those to ground. So what we need to do with this is thread it through the output lug. And it also needs to be grounded to the back of the potentiometer. Okay, so we're connected to the input lug now in our tone pot. Next thing we want to do is just ground that to the back of the pot. So I'll just move that over to the side. I'm just going to apply some heat now to the back of that pot. Feed some solder in like so. Okay, so from there, that's our volume pot grounded and our capacitor installed on our tone pot. You can see this is where the input jack goes. We're going to need to run an earth wire from the electronics cavity out into the output jack. So I'm going to give myself plenty of wire to work with here. As I said, I'm using black here just for all earth wires, just so I have a color reference. I'm just going to feed that through. As I said, I've used plenty of wire here so I can trim that up at the end. I'll just leave that sit for now, or I can simply tape that off. It's a good idea sometimes just tape these wires off so they don't come back through. The way to thread that is definitely from the inside. You can't really get it from the outside. The hole on the outside of the guitar is bigger than the hole in the internal or the inside of the electronics cavity. So I'm just going to tin my iron again, and then from there I'm just going to tin that wire as well. That's pretty much all we're trying to do. Okay, so this is a ground wire. And this is going to be going to the lug that's attached to the inner sleeve of the input jack. This section here of the input jack connects to the base of the guitar cable. So I'll just thread that through like so, push that back on itself. And from here I'll apply some heat to that lug and just push a small amount of solder on. And that's really all there is to that joint. Give it a little tug just to make sure. That's that joint's good and strong. Now I also want to connect our two potentiometers. So I'll be connecting a ground wire between those also. And as you can see, the holes are located on the guitar itself. We don't need to make these terribly long. So I'll roughly measure that out with the guitar, cut a section. Quickly tin this wire as well. And from here, all we're really trying to do is join our two the backs of our two pots together. So you can see the pot wasn't hot enough then when I was first trying to lift the iron up. Okay, so from here, same thing. Give it a few seconds to heat up and push some solder into place. So next, we're going to need to get our ground wire from the bridge onto this tone pot, which is going to be a little bit tricky because our wires are fairly short. So I'm hoping you can see that on camera. Tin that wire, I'll just tin my iron again as well. Quickly tin that wire, obviously taking care, but we're working this close to the finish of the guitar. Now I'm going to want to ground that to the back of that pot. One of the next things we need to do is also run a ground wire from our ground lug on the back of our pickup selector, which you can see is connected to the casing. Just that nearest volume pot. So again, I'm just going to cut a section long enough. I'll thread that through the eyelet of the ground lug. And quickly complete that joint. So again, just applying heat to the lug, warming it up first. A little unstable the base here. And just getting a bit of solder on that joint. From here, I'm just going to connect that to our volume pot. So if you're watching fairly carefully before, you notice I made a slight error. I've connected, hadn't pulled this wire through properly on the input jack. So I've actually wired this inside the guitar, not how we wanted it. Okay, so now we've got a good joint. Okay, so now I'm going to put the controls inside the guitar. So from here we're going to need to complete the remainder of the wiring. Actually, I may be able to get those bridge wires in place from here, which I'll do if I can. Okay, so our next step is to connect this active wire from the bridge pickup to the bridge position, on our pickup selector. So The downward position will be for our bridge. The up position will be our neck. Middle position will be a blend. So I'm going to, hopefully this will reach. I'm going to connect this red wire here. As we know, the black wire coming from our guitar is the bridge. So I'm just going to connect that to the lug that's in the downward position. I'll thread that through the hole, which is often easier said than done. As mentioned, I often use a magnifying light, which can be very handy. Spin that back around. And again, I'll just apply some heat. And that's good firm joint as well. Now I want to earth that bridge pickup to the volume also. So I'll just test that joint as well. And that's fine. So from here, I'm going to put the controls in the guitar and we'll complete the wiring from inside the electronics cavity. Okay, as you can see, I've got the guitar turned over now. I'm quickly just going to tighten those controls in place. So I've connected the wire to that first lug. And I'm just going to come along now with my iron. Heat up that lug, being very careful to avoid the guitar finish. Once it's had a few seconds, I'll just drop some solder onto that. Okay, so the next wire we need to connect is the earth off our pickup onto our volume pipe. As you can see, it's going to be a little bit of a tight fit. We're going to need to be very careful of our other wires. This is where a chisel-nosed soldering iron can be useful. Okay, so our final part of the wiring process is to take our input from our pickup selector into the input of our volume and out to the middle lug of our tone. So I'm using white wires here just so I can differentiate between them, but I'm essentially coming from the output, which is the middle lug of the pickup selector. I've already soldered that one in place. I've connected two wires here on the right edge lug, which is the input of the volume, and that's coming straight out into the middle lug of the tone, which I've already soldered in place also. From here, I'm just going to heat that lug. Drop some solder into place. We'll just test that joint. So we've got one last wire to connect, and that will be from the output of our volume to the output jack. So I'm going to just run that wire through the guitar first. Okay, so I've got that wire connected back to that lug. Just going to hold the iron on there for a second to apply some heat. to both the wire and the lug itself. And then slowly feed some solder onto that joint. Test the joint, that's fine. And finally, we just need to connect. I'll just pull this back toward the camera. And finally, we just need to connect this last white wire that we've just connected to the live lug on the output jack to the middle lug on our volume. I've already put some solder on that lug just so I didn't have to feed solder on. In this instance, just because it's a little bit finicky to get to, I'm hoping that's going to help us out. I'll push these controls back in to their respective holes. Guitar cable to go into the input, and we'll turn the amp on. What you're hearing straight away is hum. So we know you can't really hear over that hum. So what that hum's indicating is our ground circuit's not complete. So I'm suspecting once we turn over this guitar, there'll be a wire we've forgotten to install, or a wire that's come loose. So we'll just see. Of course, it's the wire off the input jack. So because we've already got a lot of ground wires going to the volume pot, I'm going to put this one to the tone pot. I think you'll find as soon as we do that, our noise will disappear. Okay, now that we've got the hardware installed and our electronics completed, the last thing we want to do is just perform a final setup of the guitar. And that's just to assure that the guitar is going to play to its very best. And this normally involves 4 stages. So first we'll look at neck relief, which essentially refers to how much relief or inward bow the neck has. Now, generally you don't want a dead straight neck. If you do, because you can see the strings vibrate quite a bit, they would be hitting the frets towards the center of the neck. So what you want to do is introduce a small amount of relief to give clearance for that vibration. As you can see, toward the middle of the neck is where the string moves the most. Okay, the other thing we want to check is action, string action, which is essentially the clearance height from the fretboard to the strings. That also assists with reducing fret buzz. After that, we'll look at intonation, which essentially is how in tune the guitar is with itself. So if we hit an E, we want to also make sure we're hitting an E at the 12th fret, an octave higher. And the last thing we'll do is just check our pickup height. Okay, so the very first thing we do whenever we're performing final setup is make sure the guitar's in tune. We need to have the correct amount of tension on the strings and on the neck. I've already tuned this a couple of times, but I would suggest stretching the strings out as well and then retuning. You'll find there's a little bit of play in most new strings. You need to get that initial stretch out. Okay, so as I said before, neck relief is essentially the amount of inward bow we have. So if you have outward bow, for example, you're going to have your strings buzzing against the fret wire. So we're aiming for just a small amount of inward bow or relief. Now the way to check that, there's two ways to do it. You can take a steel rule, and provided your frets are even, you can run along the top of the frets. Get down to eye level, and you're just looking for a couple of mil clearance above the 12th fret wire, which this is actually pretty good. Now if you don't have a steel rule, just hold down the string, the lower E at the 12th fret, at the last fret, and just tap down at the 12th fret. There should be a little bit of play there, as in if it's sitting flat, you probably don't have enough relief in the neck. If it's sitting too high, you've probably got too much. So this is about perfect. There's just enough to tap down, but it's not sitting hard against it. Now, if you did need to make adjustments to the truss rod, you would take the Allen key that's included in your packaging, and you would insert that in the end of the truss rod, which is the hole in the headstock here. Now, you work incrementally generally, so work in quarter turns, retune the guitar, and then check the amount of neck relief. Now, if you want to tighten the truss rod, which would be to remove some of the relief, you would turn it clockwise. If you want to introduce more neck relief by loosening the truss rod or loosening the tension on the neck, you turn it counterclockwise. But again, I would work in quarter turns at a maximum and check your work, and always be retuning the guitar. Okay, so moving right along, we'll get on to the action, and that's essentially the height of the strings above, or the clearance for the strings above the fretboard. Now this is usually subjective, but if you're unsure, a good starting point is about 2.5 mil, or 2.4 mil, sorry, on the low E string, and about 1.6 mil clearance on the high E. But the way this is measured is actually on top of the fret wire. So we take a steel rule like so, hold it on the fret wire, get down to eye height, and just check the clearance. So this is just a shade over 2.5 on the low E side, and just a shade over 1.6 as well on the high E side. So what I would be doing in this instance is just slightly reducing the height of our posts, our bridge posts on our Tune-O-Matic bridge. Now I'd be turning that clockwise to reduce the height. Again, I would only be turning at a maximum about half turn, and then checking again. And that looks about right to me. And we're very close on the high E side as well. Obviously you'd fine tune that a little bit more after you've played it, just to make sure you're happy. And again, I would also just tune the guitar again. It's important that you continue to retune the guitar. Any adjustments to the bridge or the truss rod will affect your tuning, obviously. Okay, so next we want to check intonation. And that is, as I said before, essentially how in tune the guitar is with itself. So as we know, a low E string should be tuned to E. And if we hit down on or fret the 12th fret, this should also be E. So as you can see, we're just a little bit sharp on that. And just make sure you're attacking that string with the same amount of attack as you're doing when you hit the open string as well. And you can see we're just a little bit sharp there. So So as you can see, our bridge is on a slant, and that's to allow slightly extra length for the thicker strings, just because they have additional mass and they need to be a little bit longer to compensate for that. Now, you can make small adjustments here as well on the individual saddles that you'll see on the bridge here through these intonation adjustment screws. So if our note is a little bit sharp, which it is in this case, what we want to do is lengthen the length of string that's able to vibrate just by adjusting that saddle slightly. Now this is what you do across all strings. I'll just demonstrate this on this string first. So as you can see, I'm just moving that saddle back further, and what that does, it just slightly increases the point of contact between the two strings, or the point of contact, the 2 points of contact between the string. So as you can see, that's further along. I'll just tune that string again. Now fret at the 12th fret. So that transient is throwing its head a little bit there, but I'm noticing when the string settles, we're pretty close. I may just lengthen that just a little bit further. So as you can see, we're pretty close there. I probably still would want to increase that, but in this instance, the individual saddle is right to the back of the bridge. So what we may need to do then is look at reducing the amount of relief on the neck just a little bit more again. Okay, now the last thing I would check is the pickup height. Now this again is subjective, but if you need a place to start, what I would aim for is about 2.4 mil clearance above the individual pole pieces to the underside of a string. Now, we don't measure that just straight up. We fret at the last fret and measure that height. And as we can see, we're miles under that. So just adjust the height of these just by turning the two screws. I'm going to turn them evenly. As you saw when we installed the pickup, the screw is located within a spring, so as soon as we reduce that tension, the pickups will pop up quite high. So I just want to make sure they're fairly even. And we're still considerably higher than we want to be. You might notice sometimes I'm tightening as well as loosening. I'm just trying to get the pickup level. And that's pretty close to what we're looking for. So as I said, aim for about 2.4 mil. But once you've got the guitar plugged in, just test it out. you may find you want to reduce the height or increase it, depending on your taste. Okay, so that's pretty much how we perform a final setup. From here, I'm going to plug the guitar in and just check for fret buzz and just give the guitar a final once over. Okay, now I'm left-handed, so unfortunately it's going to be difficult for me to do a full demonstration of this guitar, but we will test the pickups in each position and have a quick inspection of the neck. So what I would do first is just put the guitar in middle position where both pickups are on, open up the volume and tone, and just take your hands away from the guitar. Now if you're hearing any noise, any fuzz or electrical interference, it's probably a 60 cycle hum, which is from lights and electrical appliances you'll normally find around the house. If that is the case, you may want to take the back off the guitar again, open up the electronics cavity and just check your ground circuit is correct. You may have a loose wire, there may be some strands of wire causing that problem. Now, next thing I'll do is pop the guitar in each position and just check the volume's working, the tone's working. The very last thing I would do is just check the neck itself. So up and down the neck on each string at each fret, and just listen for any fret buzz or anything that's going to impede your playing. And if you do notice any problems like that, you need to put the guitar back up on the bench and either adjust your action or introduce some more neck relief to the guitar. Okay, so that's pretty much the end of the process. Hopefully you've enjoyed following along and have a completed STH guitar kit in your hands like me. Thanks for watching.